happens when federal power collides head-on with local defiance? Portland offered one of the starkest answers. In the summer streets under floodlights, in the glare of cell phone cameras, heavily armed ICE teams swept in with tactics that stunned both allies and critics. Tear gas canisters cut through the night, unmarked vans absorbed protesters in sudden swoops, and the skyline filled with flashbangs that many residents likened to a war zone. For President Donald Trump's administration, the move was deliberate, a message that defiance against federal immigration enforcement would not go unanswered. For Portlanders, it was the beginning of a siege that quickly became a national symbol. The story began with a concentrated protest outside the ICE detention facility. What might have remained a local demonstration escalated once tactical units arrived with explicit orders to control the zone. Observers say the approach mirrored counterinsurgency doctrine more familiar on battlefields in Iraq and Afghanistan. The imagery, agents in camouflage firing non-lethal rounds, streets clouded in chemical irritants, was broadcast globally. Reports from Reuters and BBC at the time described it as a dramatic test of constitutional limits between federal power and city autonomy. The strategy did not focus solely on crowd dispersal. It targeted visibility. Live streamers broadcasting events, protest leaders speaking through megaphones, and individuals identified on social media became priority arrests. According to defense news analysts, this mirrored a military decapitation tactic, removing command nodes to disorient wider movements. Names like Tatiana Martinez, accused of doxing federal officers, surfaced as examples of how digital age activism had entered ICE's operational playbook. These arrests were amplified by social media spreading fear through activist networks and ensuring others thought twice before broadcasting live from the protests. Yet the sheer force of the crackdown provoked comparisons to events unfolding thousands of miles away. In Ukraine, for example, drone strikes on Russian command posts in 2025 follow a similar logic: eliminate leaders, destabilize morale, and suppress opposition. Both contexts highlight how strategies of battlefield control can migrate into domestic policing. European observers, including German security scholars cited by DW, warned that applying counterinsurgency principles on home soil risks normalizing wartime methods in civil society. The operation also sent ripples far beyond Oregon. Russia, China, and Iran used images from Portland in state media to accuse the United States of hypocrisy on human rights. In Moscow, where dissent has been met with brutal crackdowns, Kremlin officials argued that Washington had lost moral credibility. Analysts from The Guardian noted that Trump's approach hardened perceptions of the United States abroad at a time when NATO unity was already under strain by debates over defense spending and Ukraine support. The domestic impact was just as significant. For many Americans, Portland became shorthand for the law and order divide. Supporters saw the operation as a necessary stand against chaos, proof that Trump was restoring authority. Critics labeled it authoritarian overreach, a rehearsal for broader federal policing. This divide mirrored global fractures between those demanding uncompromising security and those warning of eroded freedoms. Western experts highlighted one striking figure: nearly 70% of all Portland-related federal arrests during that first wave involved individuals accused of nonviolent offenses. That number raised pressing questions about proportionality and intent. Was this about restoring order or about deterring dissent? As one DW commentator asked, when counterinsurgency tactics move from Kabul to Portland, what remains of democratic protest? The echoes were loud, the precedents troubling, and the stage was set for a national escalation. Could Portland be remembered as the turning point when America began treating protests like warfare? If Portland marked the first strike, the follow-up revealed the precision of the federal playbook lists. Not ordinary rosters, but carefully curated digital watch lists, identifying who would be taken when and how. ICE agents moved with dossiers in hand, targeting individuals accused not of violent acts, but of visibility. The priority was not chaos in the streets, it was information in the ether. Central to this effort were live streamers. Protesters who filmed every march and clash, uploading directly to Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, suddenly became high-value targets. Analysts at Jane's Defense Weekly compared this to targeting forward observers on a battlefield. Just as artillery in Ukraine relies on spotters relaying coordinates via drones, so too did protesters rely on live streamers to expose federal actions and rally reinforcements. Neutralizing them disrupted the flow of information, effectively blinding the crowd. One of the most notable arrests was that of Tatiana Martinez, accused of publishing personal details of federal officers doxing her detention, was carried out in broad daylight surrounded by cameras. It wasn't accidental. By making an example of her, the administration demonstrated the cost of crossing into the digital battle space. The spectacle echoed tactics employed in Russia, where online dissidents have been systematically removed to deter others from challenging state narratives. Western commentators noted how IC's approach blurred the line between criminal law and psychological operations. The Guardian's editorial board argued that the arrests were as much about broadcasting power as they were about enforcing law. Each arrest, they wrote, was amplified on social media to maximize deterrence. This mirrored military doctrine, where a single strike is meant not just to eliminate an enemy, but to terrify others into silence. But targeting visibility raised deeper strategic implications. By focusing on individuals with influence, the administration risked inflaming tensions rather than suppressing them. Reuters reported that Martinez's arrest triggered a surge in online solidarity campaigns, with hashtags demanding her release trending nationwide within hours. What was intended as deterrence became fuel for further resistance. The parallels with 2025's larger conflicts are striking. In the Israel-Iran confrontation, both sides have used precision strikes against leadership figures, hoping to cripple organizational capacity. Yet military experts note the dangers such strategies often embolden adversaries, hardening their resolve. In Portland, the same dynamic unfolded. Arrests of visible figures elevated their status, transforming them from activists into martyrs. The tactic also raised alarms within NATO capitals. German lawmakers observing the events through the lens of Europe's own protest history worried aloud that America was normalizing targeted intimidation of dissent. DW commentators warned that if Washington exported these practices abroad, they could undermine the credibility of NATO's message of defending democratic freedoms. Numbers underscore the scope. IC confirmed that at least 30% of early Portland arrests were based on online activity rather than direct protest actions. In military terms, the digital domain had become a battlefield in its own right. Just as drones and cyber tools reshape external wars, social media monitoring now reshape domestic protest response. The chilling effect was immediate. Livestream numbers dropped, independent coverage dwindled, and many protesters went silent online fearing surveillance. A Columbia University analyst told BBC that the Portland crackdown pioneered a domestic information warfare model where the government doesn't just disperse protests, it erases their visibility. Could this reliance on lists and digital targeting mark the birth of a new era where protests are not broken in the streets, but dismantled in the cloud? As federal lists expanded, Portland residents soon discovered that protest zones blurred into entire neighborhoods. Collateral arrests, unplanned sweeping, and deeply controversial became the story. While ICE officials insisted that each action was targeted, footage told a different tale. Fathers detained while carrying infants passers-by, swept into vans without clear cause, and men like Robert Hoops flagged by facial recognition systems despite his pacifist record. Hoops, a community organizer known for opposing violence, was identified through digital surveillance tools that had misclassified him as a threat. His case sparked outrage. "This is the nightmare of algorithmic policing," wrote The Guardian, noting how the same facial recognition systems criticized in Russia and China had now found a foothold on American streets. Civil liberties lawyers argued that the dragnet created an atmosphere where anyone could be mistaken for an agitator. The parallels with global conflicts were unavoidable. In Ukraine, inaccurate drone target data has led to tragic civilian casualties. Similarly, in Portland, flawed intelligence systems placed ordinary citizens in detention. DW reported that more than 20% of those initially detained were later released without charges, a statistic critics cited as evidence of reckless overreach. The human cost extended beyond the individuals detained. Families were left traumatized children separated from parents, and entire communities fell under siege. Analysts from Reuters described how the crackdown imposed a psychological cost that spread far beyond the protests themselves. Residents began to avoid downtown altogether, fearing not just clashes, but arbitrary arrest. This retreat mirrored tactics in conflict zones where the population withdraws, leaving contested ground to the forces that control it. Observers also noted the optics. Internationally, the images of crying children and bewildered parents circulated on news outlets from Al Jazeera to BBC. For adversaries such as Iran and China, the footage was propaganda gold. State media in Tehran aired segments juxtaposing Portland arrests with American criticisms of Iranian protest crackdowns, accusing Washington of double standards. In Beijing, commentators used Portland to argue that the US model of democracy was collapsing under its own contradictions. Strategically, These collateral arrests undermined the administration's claims of restoring order. Instead, they raised questions about whether federal forces were capable of distinguishing between protesters and civilians. NATO allies, particularly in Europe, voiced concerns. German lawmakers warned that America's actions risked normalizing militarized policing within Western democracies, blurring the line between internal security and battlefield tactics. At the same time, the Trump administration doubled down. Officials insisted that the arrests were necessary to prevent escalation. Defense News pointed out that this logic echoed counterinsurgency strategies where the line between combatant and civilian is deliberately broadened to maximize control. Yet history shows the risks in Iraq and Afghanistan. Such practices often alienated local populations and fueled insurgency. Experts emphasized one chilling number in Portland: nearly half of the first 100 detainees had no prior protest-related activity. That figure forced a difficult question: if the net is cast too wide, does it capture threats or merely silence dissent? This tension between security and freedom became the core of the Portland debate. As civil rights groups filed lawsuits and as international criticism mounted, the city found itself transformed into a stage for the world to watch. Could it be that in attempting to quell unrest, the federal response actually magnified it, turning Portland from a protest hotspot into a symbol of authoritarian overreach? The Portland operation was only the beginning. Within weeks, the strategy leapt across the country, culminating in a dramatic sweep in Connecticut. Dubbed Operation Broken Trust, the raid resulted in 65 arrests, sending shockwaves through a state that had prided itself on sanctuary protections. Federal agents argued that the operation dismantled organized networks of agitators, but the clash with Connecticut's Trust Act ignited a political storm. The Trust Act limited local cooperation with federal immigration enforcement, a policy celebrated by immigrant rights groups. By storming through with mass arrests, the Trump administration directly challenged state sovereignty. Reuters noted that Operation Broken Trust placed Connecticut on the front lines of America's constitutional struggle between federal power and state autonomy. The optics were striking local officials caught between honoring state law and deferring to armed federal teams patrolling their streets. The political fallout escalated quickly. A local lawmaker who publicly warned constituents about the raids faced accusations of aiding obstruction, with some voices in Washington calling for prosecution. The Guardian reported that Trump's allies seized on this moment, demanding harsh penalties for politicians who, in their view, undermine national security. To supporters, the confrontation showcased Trump's resolve. To critics, it was evidence of creeping authoritarianism. The Connecticut sweep also revealed a national template: identify resistant states, deploy high-visibility raids, and dare local leaders to resist. DW analysts compared this to Russia's federal crackdown on regional governors, who challenged Moscow's authority. In both cases, centralized power moved aggressively to discipline local defiance. But the operation carried unintended consequences. On social media, hashtags condemning broken trust trended nationally within hours. Civil rights lawyers filed lawsuits claiming violations of constitutional protections. Immigrant communities across New England mobilized, organizing protests that ironically swelled in size after the raids. BBC correspondents noted that the crackdown may have radicalized populations that otherwise remained passive. Global parallels were again instructive. In Ukraine, Russia's failed offensives in 2025 have often sparked stronger resistance rather than submission. Military analysts argue that heavy-handed tactics can consolidate opposition instead of weakening it. The Connecticut case illustrated the same paradox. By attempting to crush dissent, federal forces amplified it. NATO observers paid close attention. European lawmakers expressed concern that America's hardline domestic posture might bleed into its international role. A German Defense Committee member told DW, if the US normalizes sweeping away opposition at home, what message does it send about NATO's commitment to democratic values abroad? The criticism landed at a delicate moment, as NATO sought unity over support for Ukraine while balancing tensions with China in the Pacific. Numbers underscored the controversy. Out of the 65 individuals arrested, nearly 40% were charged with administrative violations rather than violent offenses. Critics cited this as proof that Operation Broken Trust was more about show than substance. Defense News analysts went further, arguing that the operation resembled information warfare, seizing headlines to project strength rather than dismantling actual threats. Yet the spectacle was undeniable. National broadcasts replayed footage of heavily armed teams storming Connecticut streets. Supporters heralded it as a victory for Trump's America First law and order agenda, proof that no state could defy federal will. For others, it was a chilling reminder that political dissent could invite military-style enforcement. Could Operation Broken Trust be remembered not as a victory for order, but as the moment America's internal conflicts began to look indistinguishable from its external wars? Behind the flashing lights and televised raids lay a quieter but equally explosive debate quotas morale and the creeping scope of federal overreach. Inside ICE, seasoned officers began to whisper about mounting pressure from Washington. Arrest numbers became the metric of success, and the old focus on complex investigations, tracking human trafficking networks, or dismantling cartel pipelines gave way to easier arrests that padded daily tallies. Reuters cited internal memos suggesting that agents were encouraged to prioritize volume over depth. In practice, that meant more neighborhood sweeps, more collateral arrests, and fewer long-term operations. For veterans of the agency, it was a demoralizing shift. One retired official told BBC that agents trained to dismantle sophisticated operations were reduced to chasing numbers, not criminals. The ripple effects were profound. Morale inside ICE plummeted with reports of rising resignations. Analysts from The Guardian noted that this mirrored the experience of NATO forces in Afghanistan, where success was often measured by body counts rather than strategic stability, a system that eventually collapsed under its own contradictions. When numbers replace nuanced strategy, outcomes grow unstable. Compounding these internal tensions was a controversial proposal, expanding the role of the National Guard. Defense News reported that discussions within the Trump administration explored deploying Guard units to reinforce ICE in states where resistance was highest. Though technically within presidential authority, the move blurred dangerous lines between civilian policing and military deployment. NATO allies voiced alarm with German parliamentarians, warning that such steps normalize militarized solutions in societies that once prided themselves on civilian control. These concerns were not abstract. In 2025, the same debate reverberates globally. Israel's reliance on reservist deployments against Iranian-backed militias has sparked questions about sustainability and the risk of eroding civilian trust in security institutions. Likewise, in Ukraine, overextension of forces and prolonged campaigns has strained morale and blurred the distinction between front lines and civilian zones. Portland and Connecticut reflected a similar dilemma in miniature. When law enforcement begins to resemble warfare, the social contract itself comes under pressure. Statistics tell the story starkly. According to leaked figures cited by DW, more than 60% of ICE field offices reported quota pressure as their top concern by the end of the first crackdown wave. This obsession with metrics overshadowed the deeper question: was order being restored, or was dissent simply being suppressed through intimidation? Experts across the Atlantic raised alarms. A BBC analyst wrote, "The danger of quotas is not only misallocation of resources, but the erosion of democratic legitimacy. Numbers can show strength, but legitimacy is measured in restraint." Domestically, the quota system fueled criticism that Trump's law and order campaign was less about public safety and more about political theater. Critics argued that each raid, each arrest, each viral clip of armored agents storming a street was designed to project dominance ahead of the 2024 election cycle, a strategy that carried into his second term. Supporters countered that visible force was precisely what the nation needed, pointing to rising crime statistics and chaotic protests as proof. But the broader question lingered: when federal forces pursue quotas and deploy the military to enforce domestic order, does the United States risk reshaping its democracy into something far less recognizable? By the time the Portland model spread nationwide, the United States had crossed a threshold that many allies and adversaries alike were watching with unease. What began as a crackdown in one city had evolved into a template of governance, curated arrests, facial recognition, social media targeting, and federal deployments that blurred the line between civil order and military operations. To many, it looked less like policing and more like counterinsurgency at home. International observers drew immediate comparisons. Al Jazeera highlighted how the US response echoed strategies long condemned in authoritarian regimes, publicly targeting protest leaders, silencing visibility, and deploying overwhelming force to project dominance. DW's coverage warned that NATO's credibility could suffer. How can Washington criticize Moscow's suppression of dissent? One German lawmaker asked, when Portland looks eerily similar to Minsk. Numbers only sharpened the debate. Nearly 70% of those detained in the early months of the crackdown were released without charges, according to leaked reports. That figure, combined with growing evidence of mistaken identities through facial recognition, suggested that the federal strategy relied less on due process than on deterrence through fear. Western experts described it as demonstration arrests designed to shift the psychology of protest rather than punish specific crimes. Strategically, the precedent reverberated across NATO discussions. As Russian forces struggled in Ukraine and Beijing tested American resolve in the South China Sea, European capitals worried about Washington's ability to claim the moral high ground. A Reuters analysis noted that authoritarian powers quickly seized on Portland as proof that American democracy was performative, weakening the West's ideological leverage. Domestically, the effects were equally profound. Protests declined not necessarily because dissent evaporated, but because citizens feared the consequences of visibility. Columbia University researchers told BBC that a chilling effect spread across urban America. Portland was no longer just a place, it was a warning. In the words of one analyst from Defense News, the Portland model exported fear more effectively than it restored peace. The parallels with 2025's wars were unavoidable. In Ukraine, Russia's reliance on heavy-handed crackdowns in occupied territories has only deepened resistance. In Israel's confrontation with Iran, targeted assassinations have hardened militias rather than neutralized them. These lessons suggest that overwhelming force can silence in the short term, but fuel long-term instability. Portland may have been no different. The key question then is what kind of democracy emerges when dissent is treated as insurgency? Supporters of Trump's law and order doctrine argue that extraordinary times require extraordinary measures, that cities on fire justified federal intervention. Critics counter that once such powers are normalized, they rarely retreat. A Guardian editorial concluded, "What begins in Portland rarely ends in Portland. It becomes the script for the nation." As America's allies recalibrate and adversaries weaponize the imagery, the stakes extend far beyond city streets. Portland may one day be remembered not only as a flashpoint of protest, but as the crucible where the balance between freedom and security tilted irrevocably. So the question lingers, was this the defense of democracy or the rehearsal of something far more dangerous? Portland's protests became the testing ground for a federal crackdown that redefined America's balance between order and freedom. Under President Donald Trump, IC deployed counterinsurgency-style tactics more familiar to foreign battlefields than U.S. streets, tear gas, van detentions, and targeted arrests of live streamers and digital activists. What began as a confrontation outside an ICE facility quickly escalated into a national model replicated in operations like Broken Trust in Connecticut. Collateral arrests, facial recognition errors, and quota-driven enforcement deepened controversy. Nearly 70% of detainees faced no charges, revealing a strategy built on deterrence through fear. Analysts warned this mirrored authoritarian playbooks abroad, while NATO allies questioned America's credibility in championing democracy. Global parallels with the wars in Ukraine and Israel underscored the risks of overwhelming force. It silences dissent temporarily, but strengthens long-term opposition. For supporters, the crackdown symbolized Trump's law and order commitment. For critics, it marked a dangerous precedent, treating protest as insurgency and exporting battlefield methods to city streets. The international consequences were equally stark. Adversaries weaponized Portland imagery to undermine U.S. influence, while allies worried about democratic erosion. Was Portland the restoration of order or the rehearsal of authoritarian governance in America's future?